Welcome to our session on chapter finances. I'd like to welcome National Counselor Michael Loomis.
Good evening, and welcome to the Phi Kappa Tau progress session on chapter finances. My name is Michael Loomis, and I'll be leading you through the session tonight. I currently sit on Phi Kappa Tau's National Council, but my first leadership position in Phi Tau was as a treasurer at Belmont University, at Belmont Colony. I later served as president of the colony until we chartered as Zeta Alpha chapter, and since have served in a number of volunteer roles throughout the organization. But I still think very fondly on my time as a treasurer, and I think about all the things that I learned about finances, about leadership, and about Phi Tau in that role. So I'm very excited about leading the session with you tonight. In my day-to-day professional life, I serve as Vice President of Strategy and Chief of Staff for a software company called Aprimo. And while that encompasses a number of things, one part of my charter is leading our strategic planning process. That's aligned with our long-term financial plans, our annual operating budget, and then how do we marshal and optimize all the resources that we have as a company to achieve our goals. A lot of what I apply in my day-to-day, I started to learn as a chapter treasurer, doing the same thing with our chapter's finances. So again, I'm very excited and honored to be able to share some thoughts with you tonight that hopefully help you, improve your chapter's finances as well. So let's get going. We're not going to cover everything you need to know as a chapter treasurer or as a member or advisor involved with chapter finances tonight. There's a lot of resources available that I'll cover at the end. We're not going to go into the ins and outs of national dues or billing or how to leverage chapter SPA. What we really wanted to do is cover a handful of topics related to planning and budgeting, financial reporting, governance, collecting dues, and other resources, but really leave you with some things that may not be obvious from the other resources you have at your disposal, or may not be obvious just from walking into a chapter to work on its finances. And so we'll leave you with 5 best practices, 5 things that you can take back to think about and to apply in your own situation. And we'll start with number 1 here. It's really important to start by building a great budget. But a great budget as a static document is not enough. You need to understand that as you apply that budget, it will change. So a couple things I want to talk about here. First is a budget is in many ways a reflection on your priorities and on your strategy. And so before jumping into a budgeting process as a chapter, you should have a conversation about what you want to achieve, where you want to focus, what initiatives you want to put in play, and what you want those outcomes to be as a group. And then as you craft the budget should reflect and appropriately resource what it's going to take to help you achieve your goals. That's a really good and important first step. But another thing that's really important is that a budget isn't static. The minute you put a budget to paper and start spending the money, it's going to change. Things are going to be less or more than you thought they were going to cost. You'll have more or less revenue than you thought was going to come in. You may have a bigger than expected recruitment, and now you have a lot more dues paying members, and the budget needs to adapt to that. So you need to, at the front end, understand what are those impact areas and have a budget that will allow you to manage throughout the semester and throughout the year as the theoretical budget becomes reality. So there's a few things that you can do and consider during your budgeting process and actually build into your budget itself, particularly if you have a proficient Excel user who can model this stuff out, that will help set you up for success and for the changing nature of your budget throughout the year. The first is having a good view on which of your costs are fixed and which of the costs are variable. Fixed things are things that are, a good example of these are a fee per chapter that's that's due to your university or to the executive offices. Regardless of what you do this semester, regardless of how many members you have, that cost is going to be the same. And so you should code it as such. Other costs are going to be highly variable. Your insurance cost is variable based on the number of members that you have in the chapter. Your cost for food at an event will be variable based on the number of attendees at that event. By identifying your fixed and your variable expenses in your budget, it will help you understand how that budget will change as the variable things become reality. The other piece of that is similarly looking at what are committed expenses versus discretionary. There's some things that you know or you have to do and you have to pay. Again, any fees to the university, your insurance, any national dues, those are things that you know going into every semester need to be in the budget. The other, what's remaining, is your discretionary expenses. And these are the things that you need to have a conversation about how you want to strategically deploy that resource. And we talked about earlier about having it aligned to your priorities. A similar thing happens on the revenue side, the income side of your budget. As some income is fixed, you know how much you're going to charge in dues per member for the semester. Some is variable. You have a fundraiser and you don't really know going in how much you're going to raise from that fundraiser. It can be a little, it can be a lot, or somewhere in between. And likewise, you have some income that's fairly guaranteed. Again, member dues. You know what's going to come in, and you know that hopefully everybody's going to pay their dues, and that's kind of come in. Again, other things are not so guaranteed. So that will give you the essentially the different scenarios for how much money will come in. With these four kind of views of your budget, you should be able to run some scenarios. What if we have a giant recruitment class? What if we have a small recruitment class? What if we have a giant fundraising outcome? What if we have a small fundraising outcome? What does that mean to our overall budget and how much money we have left at the end of the day? So that will help you set up for success. The last thing that a lot of chapters overlook is cash flow. Essentially what we're talking about here is how much cash do you have on hand, and how does the timing of when you receive money versus when you need to pay costs impact that. Some chapters will end up in a cash crunch because they have a lot of expenses that are due early in the semester, but they don't collect all of their dues until later in the semester. And so you end up in a situation where you don't have the cash in the account to pay for what you need. Not because you're not going to have it later in the semester, but because you don't have it now. And so at least having a high-level idea, month to month, what's going to come in that month and what's going to go out that month, and making sure you have enough cash available to keep the chapter solvent is an important yet often overlooked part of the budgeting process. So all this will set you up to have a really strong budget, which is a great first step. But this is only the start. A lot of times we think about the chapter finances as setting the budget, and that as long as you have a good budget, you're good to go. But that's not really the case. That gives you a map, but it doesn't get you to the destination. And so it's really a team effort to get you to that destination. And so as a treasurer, often I'll see too often treasurers kind of going it alone. But you should really have a number of people involved in the process. Your executive council should have a strong pulse on the chapter's finances and be involved in a lot of the decision making. The chapter should have a high level understanding of where we're at. They should be involved in approving the budget. They should be aware of what the chapter's financial state is, and should be regularly updated there. Your board of governors should be very involved in your financial discussions around budget. We'll talk more about kind of reporting and the discussions we want to have with the board of governors, but they're a great resource to provide expert advice, to provide counsel, and also to make sure that we keep things on track. And the last thing, the executive offices. has a number of contacts you can work with, not just on the billing that you get from the executive offices for your national dues, your insurance, your program fees to attend, Leadership Academy, the convention, and other events, which hopefully in the not too distant future we'll be convening in person again to hold, but also to advise on other aspects of your chapter finances. Really leverage those resources you have available to you as well. Too often what I see is we don't have good discussions and communication that happens among all those different groups. We may have a discussion here or there, we may have an update here or there, but not true collaboration. And we'll give some bonus points to whoever first identifies the movie this is from in the chat. As a hint, there is a Phi Talk connection in this film, but you have a famous movie quote: "What we have here is a failure to communicate." And a lot of the challenges we have with chapter finances we can either avoid or overcome just by better collaboration and better problem solving among all the different groups that we're working with. So that brings us to our best practice number 2. And it's really important that you provide a full financial report to each of those constituent groups, the executive council, your chapter, and your board of governors. And we want that to happen every month, and not once a semester, and not a partial financial update, but it will really set you out for success if you can provide a full financial report every month to your EC, the chapter, at least at a high level, and the board of governors. So let's talk about what is in a great monthly financial report. And there's 5 things that we want to make sure we're covering in our financial report. And it doesn't have to be super complex. It doesn't have to be really long, incredibly detailed, but we do want the right level of information and the right context of information that enables us to have productive discussions around where the chapter is financially, what we need to go do, where we're coming short, and any problems we need to solve and how to solve those. So the first thing is essentially an income statement that covers the revenue, the income that came in the door, collections of dues or dues that were billed, fundraising that came in, any type of revenue that's coming into the chapter, as well as any expenses that are incurred by the chapter, and then how those compare to one another, what we call net income, essentially the income minus the expenses. That'll give you a really strong understanding kind of where we're at and how we're doing. It's often great to provide also an update on how that's changed since the last time we provided the report, but we definitely want to be reporting each month on revenue and expenses as well as net income. The second, I'll call it a balance sheet, but I don't think that you really need a full-on balance sheet as a chapter in most situations. The most important things that you do need to make sure that you're reporting on are your assets. In most cases, this is going to be your checking and savings accounts. Some chapters have other types of assets, but the bulk for most chapters is going to be your checking and savings account. What is the balance in those? How has that changed since the last time we provided the report last month? And the second is your liabilities, your debts. If you're on a payment plan with the executive offices, if you have a line of credit, you have other debt that you've incurred, then what is the balance on that debt? And again, how has that changed since the last month? How are we paying that down? But at least at a high level, you need to provide that information every month. The third is a budget update. And in some cases, chapters will provide this as part of an income statement. You can certainly do so. In other cases, it's easier to pull it out as a separate update. But what we really want to do is take provide the original budget we talked about earlier. But of that budget, for each line item or kind of bucket of money, how much have we spent to date? How much do we have remaining and left to spend? Do we think we're going to be over budget or under budget for that line item? Are there any changes to that or risks that we need to talk about? So that will give us a strong idea of how we're performing versus the budget, but also give us some forward visibility into potential issues, cost overruns, or on maybe money that we have available because something was under budget that we want to make sure that we redeploy into other things that we want to accomplish and make sure we're taking advantage of that. The fourth item you'll include is an accounts receivable or aging report. This is, in most cases, dues that you're owed by brothers, and if those are overdue, which brothers owe which amount, and how overdue is that. We want this to be kind of coming down over time, but we do want to be providing a report on how much dues were owed by whom, if that's overdue, and how overdue. Is it a week overdue? That's a much different thing than if it's 2 months overdue, or a semester. Hopefully not a semester overdue or 2 semesters, but providing that visibility in a report format is important. And then lastly, any requested approvals. When you provide your financial report, that's also the opportunity to get any approvals that you need to move forward. Approval to incur a large expense, to sign a contract, to impart some sanction or financial suspension for members who are well overdue on paying their dues. Any changes to a bank account, any new debt, all that needs to be approved, and depending on what that is, and we'll talk later about good governance, but that's the kind of the last piece of the puzzle here when you talk about your financial report. So there's a number of things to report on here, but again, it doesn't have to be super complicated. If you do use something like QuickBooks to manage your chapter finances, this is as simple as exporting these reports directly from that. It's a click of a button. But even if you use Excel, then you can build this into the Excel documents that you use to manage your chapter finances, and then just provide that to your BOG, to your executive council, and then a summary to the chapter on a monthly basis. That brings us to our third best practice, and we talked about collecting dues just a little bit, but the best practice we want to impart here is don't let late dues get out of control. We want to act early. So there's a few things that we can do to make sure that we are effectively collecting the dues that we're owed, so that we don't end up in a cash crunch, we don't end up in a budget crunch, and that we're effectively managing the chapter's finances. This is important because when we don't collect dues from brothers, it does two things. One, we talked about the importance of cash on hand and making sure that we don't end up in a cash crunch. But the longer this goes on, the less likely you are to collect the dues at all. And that doesn't mean that you just lose the revenue. You've also incurred the costs for those members, and every other brother's having to chip in to cover that cost. So it's really not fair to the chapter as a whole when we don't have everybody pulling their full weight. So there's a few things that we can do to make sure that that's happening. The first is it's very important to set expectations up front. This starts during recruitment. Make sure that we're transparent with the financial commitment to the organization, what we expect, and then following through as we onboard new members, making sure that we have written financial contracts for members that outline the dues that are owed, the different payment options that are available there, and that everybody's committed to that. So having that transparency, having those conversations up front, having written financial commitments up front will set you out on the right foot and avoid issues down the road. The second is use the technology that's available to you. Lots of chapters use ChapterSpot as a way to manage their dues billing and collection. There's other solutions out there. I know some chapters have used Omega Financial in the past. But this does two things. One, it provides a clear record and transparency on who owes what's been paid, when it was paid, and how. There's no questions about that. But secondly, it provides just a level of convenience for you to have real-time information around, or other advisors or chapter officers to have real-time information to what's going on, but also for brothers who are paying dues, they can easily understand what's owed. They can pay it directly online. So use the technology you have available to you. Third is when we start to encounter a situation where we're not collecting dues on time, and there's a number of reasons this happens. But no matter what, the key is we want to have frequent communication with brothers who we're working with to make sure that we're either able to fulfill their financial commitment to the chapter, but also make sure that we're codifying those discussions in writing. If that conversation is happening in person or over a phone call, what we want to do is kind of recap that conversation in an email or some other type of note in writing, so that down the road everybody has the same recollection of what was agreed to. If it was a certain payment plan, if it's a certain date when dues would be paid by. We want to be having those conversations again often, and make sure that if that's not happening over a written format, that we are capturing and circulating the notes of that afterwards. Very often we'll have a conversation. Somebody will agree, okay, I'll have it, half of it paid next week. We say, okay, we're good to go. Next week comes, the week after comes, everybody forgets what was discussed, and we're back on the starting line. So we want to avoid that. And then lastly, we talked about this already, but just addressing problems early, being proactive. Too often we'll have a situation where maybe a brother gets behind, and now he's a semester behind in dues, and then now he's just 2 semesters behind in dues, and now we're finally having a conversation 3 semesters behind in dues about what to do about it. By that time, the debt is really large, and the likelihood of a good outcome for everybody, the brother in question, the chapter, is slim. And so we want to be very proactive and not letting things slide. It doesn't mean we have to be hard-assed about everything. We do need to be making progress with overdue dues payments. We can provide flexibility in payment plans, but things can't just drag out for months and semesters on end. Again, you're just not going to end up with a good outcome with that. So addressing that early, making sure that you're making constant progress, even if somebody has to pay a little bit every week or a little bit every 2 weeks, as long as we're making progress, that's the big thing. Where you end up in a bad situation is where the amount due keeps going up, there's little progress being made, and we don't address it until a semester or 2 semesters down the road. By the time, it's often too late. So this brings us to our 4th best practice, and that's strong governance equals strong brotherhood. Strong governance is going to allow you to do a couple things. One is to allow you to avoid a lot of potential issues in the first place, so that you don't end up in a situation where you're having to solve problems or having to undo things or having to adapt. It's going to make sure that we are making the right decisions and executing those in the right way from the outset. The second thing it's going to do is give everybody assurance that everything's on the up and up. It's going to leave no room for, or very little room, at least for error, for at the extreme fraud, which, believe it or not, we do see every once in a while, but unfortunately so, things that are just beyond the lines when people have access to chapter resources. And so we want to put strong governance in place that will ensure effectiveness, good operations, and ultimately a stronger brotherhood by avoiding issues before they happen. So what this comes down to is having some controls in place, some policies that help you have the right oversight of your chapter finances and of your money, and also good risk management of any exposure there. So the first thing I'll talk about is expense approvals, and it's really important to have documented expense approvals and different levels of expense approvals. The treasurer may be able to approve spending money on something up to a certain amount, or maybe a committee chairman can spend $100. If it's up to $250, it has to go to the treasurer to also approve. If it's up to $1,000, it has to go to the EC to also approve. And if it's over $1,000, it has to go to the BOG to also approve. And so by the time you have the committee chairman running it up the ladder, and if it's over $1,000, in this hypothetical scenario, the BOG has seen that, they've approved it, and we're all good to go. You can design that in any way that makes the most sense for your chapter's budget and how you operate. But the important thing is to make sure that there's clear understanding of not everybody can just go and spend money. And the more we're spending on something, the more the higher the more steps we want and the more people we want to have eyes on it to make sure that it is in line with the budget, that it was anticipated, that it's being spent prudently, and that we're all good to go. The second one is kind of tactical, but just making sure that you have dual signatures on checks, particularly large checks. Again, the no single point of failure is kind of the key here. You want to make sure that you have the right level of oversight when you're spending the chapter's money. Something simple like if it's a large transaction, making sure that 2 people have signed the check, so that one person's not able to go do that on their own, and is a good best practice here. Same thing with credit and debit cards. First off, limiting the number of credit and debit cards you have floating around. There shouldn't be a need for kind of more than a couple in the right people's hands. And then this is something that a lot of chapters will just kind of skip. But for anybody who does hold a credit or debit card or any kind of cards that you have, making sure that at the end of each month that you're actually producing an expense report to align the expenses that were incurred on that card. And same thing with other accounts. But making sure that's aligned to approved budget line items, that it's gone through the right approvals, and it doesn't slip through the cracks. Make sure that every expense has been reviewed and has the right level of oversight. Just through a very simple expense report at the end of the month is a good step here as well. When you work with vendors or suppliers, a couple of things I would note here. First is you make sure you take the time, particularly if it's a large amount of money, to do a little bit of negotiation. Most things, not everything is open to negotiation, but a lot of things are. Particularly if it's a large vendor contract, and so there's obviously the price point. You want to get the best price, but a couple of things I don't often see have to negotiate, but probably should take a look to are other contractual terms. What happens if we have to cancel, and do we have the best scenario there where we're not going to be on the hook? We have more. We can cancel sooner to the event. The cancellation terms is something I would take a look at. Minimum spend levels. I've seen cases where a chapter has committed to a large amount of minimum spend and doesn't have the attendance they think, and then they end up with way too much cost. And so taking a look at some of those finer points, you don't have to go into a really intense negotiation, but at least having a discussion around some of the things that will limit your exposure if things don't go according to plan will save you headache down the road. And then thirdly, having clear lines of accountability for who can sign contracts. You don't want everybody in the chapter going and signing contracts on behalf of the chapter. When somebody signs on behalf of the chapter, they're signing, like I said, on behalf of the chapter. The chapter is accountable to fulfill that. And so you want just a couple of people with the approval, particularly anything that has a financial commitment to it, to be able to sign that contract, and you want to make sure that the contract's not signed until the right level of approvals to spend the money have been made. It sounds kind of simplistic, but it's really something that's often overlooked and important. And even in the business world, I think you would be surprised at even in very large companies, the levels of approval that contracts go to and who's signing contracts. And so in my professional career, we worked with a lot of very large multi-billion-dollar organizations who are our customers. And what we will often think of as a small contract in the context of that person's business will still be signed by somebody with a SVP title or a CXO, someone with a chief at the beginning of their title, just because organizations realize that gives them the ability to make sure that nothing is being committed to on their behalf that hasn't been properly vetted. And then lastly, just an overall culture of personal accountability, in general, but also as it relates to your chapter's finances. There's no passing the buck, where we own our mistakes, we make them right, and that there's the right level of just accountability over how we're managing things. It's all too often, as I mentioned, you'll have everything from a simple inadvertent mistake, but all the way to people spending money on for personal things out of chapter funds, which it's happened, and that some simple steps can avoid, so that we're focusing the chapter's attention on achieving the things we want to achieve, being successful, accomplishing our goals, and not on resolving financial issues. So the last best practice we'll talk about, number 5 here, it's better to grow out of a financial crunch than to cut your way out of it. I think a lot of chapters, you'll end up in a situation at some point in the chapter's life where you've got a budget crunch. You've got mounting debt, or you have more expenses than you have cash on hand. You have more expensive than you have in revenue come in the door. And there's 2 ways you can get out of that. The first is is austerity. You cut everything you can cut down to the bare minimum, to just your fixed expenses, and everything else goes to resolving the budget issue. Or the second is you grow your revenue. You have more members paying dues. Your total dues being collected is going up. The resources available to the chapter is going up, and you grow your way out of it. That's always the better way. It's always the more fun way. You certainly have to be responsible. So I'm not saying that in the short term you continue to spend money you don't have. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. But at a certain point, you have to. Once you kind of stop the bleeding and start paying down the debt, or whatever the situation that you're in, ultimately over the long term, working with the chapter on growing through good recruitment practices, good membership retention practices, is going to put you in a much better financial situation. Chapters have a good deal of fixed expenses. We go back to our first point about budgeting and fixed versus variable expenses. Chapters have a lot of fixed expenses. If you have $1,000 fixed expense, something that's going to be the same whether you have 1 member or 100 members, and you have 10 members in the chapter, then each person's chipping in $100 towards that one expense. If you double the chapter to 20 members, then you're only paying $50 a piece towards that expense. If you double it again to 40 members, now you're only paying $25. And so you've gone from $100 per person going towards paying for that one thing to $25 per going to that same thing. And so what that does is it frees up a lot more resources to do the fun stuff and the stuff that's aligned to your goals, and the stuff that goes beyond just staying afloat and surviving to really thriving and achieving as an organization. And that's really what we want. And so, as a leader in your chapter, when you kind of have a situation where the resources aren't there, you first figure out how to stop the bleeding, get things under control, get the budget balanced, get debt paid down, but quickly turn your eyes towards how do we grow as an organization, have more brothers in the chapter paying dues, and that's going to ultimately put you on a much better financial trajectory and put you on a much better path to success. So to recap, 5 things we wanted to take it away today: building a great budget, one that's aligned to your strategy, one that's aligned to your goals, having flexibility built in, and to where as you go through the semester and through the year, you understand how many members you're going to have at any given point in time. As you realize exactly how much it's going to cost to do something, that your budget adapts and you're able to evolve it and make sure that you're redeploying those resources ideally towards the things that are going to help you achieve your goals. Secondly, providing that full financial report every month, each and every month, to your executive council, to your board of governors, providing a high-level summary to the chapter, having all 5 elements in that report: your income statement, your balance sheet for your assets and debts, your update on your budget, your dues outstanding and how those are aging, and then any approvals that you need, making sure that you're kind of getting into that regular rhythm. Third is being proactive about dues collection, acting early, don't letting overdue get out of control, getting out on the right foot by being transparent, using technology, making sure you have things in writing, and really effectively managing your dues collection. Fourth is having that strong governance in place that's going to help you avoid the issues in the first place. Make sure all the information is up on the table, that you have the right oversight and transparency, and ultimately that results in a stronger brotherhood. And then fifth, making sure that you're financially prudent, but focusing on how you can best grow out of your financial crunch after you solidify kind of where you're at, rather than continually cutting your way out of it. Growing the chapter will give you more financial resources, will allow you to do more things that you want to do, and allow you to achieve optimally. So hopefully this has been helpful. Hopefully you can apply this and are good reminders as you work through this semester and the coming semesters in managing your chapter's finances. A couple of last things before we go. One is a reminder, there's a handful of financial reports that you'll submit regularly to the executive offices. The first is your IRS Form 990. The most important thing is to submit this to the IRS. The second most important thing is to make sure you also file a copy with the executive offices. You do that once a year. And then each semester you'll submit three things. Your budget, once you have your initial budget completed, you'll submit that. Also your roster updates, any changes to your roster membership, and then the semester billing itself, which will happen every semester. There's also a number of resources that are available to you beyond just what we've talked about today. There's a Chapter Treasurer Officer Manual, which will has lots of instructions, how-tos. It will walk you through timelines for each semester's billing, how different things work. Great resource for you as a reference guide. Also some Excel templates that you can leverage, one for developing your budget, another for developing payment plans. And then there's also, we talked about having a member financial contract in place for all of your members. There's a Word document template for that. So all those are available from your Success Manager, so work with them, get access to those. I think there'll be some additional resources in the future as well that we'll look to make available. So once again, thanks for attending. Thanks for serving as a leader in your chapter, as a chapter treasurer, a chapter president or vice president, a board of governors, financial advisor, or chapter advisor, or BOG chair, a member of the chapter or an alumnus who contributes and helps with the chapter's finances. Thank you for your contributions. This is, I think finances are often overlooked, but important part of kind of fueling the resources that we need for the chapter to be successful. And as I talked quite a bit about, achieving our strategies and our goals, and kind of help equip us to get things done. And hopefully with these best practices, you can make it a resource and not a source of issues. So again, thanks for attending. We'll continue to take some Q&A or the chat and pick it up in the hangar from here. And we'll continue from there. I look forward to hearing what all you achieve over the coming semester and in years to come. And hoorah.
Thank you for joining us tonight for Progress Week 3. Before you go, we'd like to encourage you to fill out our Week 3 survey. And now for some closing thoughts, National Counselor Ray Carlos.
Good evening, brothers. It's great to be with you this evening. I hope you received a lot of information today and are ready to commit to goals during next week's session. It's been about a year since I've been with you during our founder celebration. A lot has changed in that year, and a lot has stayed the same. Earlier today, there was a session on risk management. And when we talk about risk management and prevention, we are also talking about health and wellness. The idea that our members are making healthy choices for themselves and others, especially when they are in crisis. We also discussed finances today, and perhaps the accountability of your members paying dues. I think we have all heard the saying that brotherhood begins when the bills are paid. But are we ensuring that everyone is receiving a brotherhood? Have we checked in lately with those who owe dues to see how they are, rather than just to collect money? All of these areas are connected to mental health. Let's be real here. That term, mental health, has a negative stigma tied to it. We use the term physical health when ensuring our bodies are healthy, when our endurance is up and our blood pressure is low. Well, mental health is no different. It just means we are paying attention to what goes on up here. Many of us are feeling stuck inside these days, concerned about catching the virus or giving it to someone else, Tired of staring at your screen, stuck in a Zoom universe, and hearing the universal saying, "Sorry, I was on mute." Perhaps some of us are trying to manage going to school online with family members around, or keeping your children focused while you're trying to maintain your job, if you're lucky enough to have kept yours, or been able enough to find one after graduating. And many of us have lost loved ones during this pandemic. Look, I don't need to explain this to you. Many of you have been experiencing it. What I do know now is that some of our members have joined Phi-Ta without having a chapter meeting in person, or connecting with someone else during an in-person recruitment event. Maybe you're one of them. But what that tells me is that we are doing a pretty good job being creative. I've been impressed listening to how chapters are continuing to recruit, the creation and increased activity on Discord so you all can connect with each other. This tells me that we don't need to be in person to show that we care. So, now is the time to be your brother's keeper. Not just those in your chapter or colony, but within the collective brotherhood that spans across this globe. So reach out to one another. Reach out to another brother. Send a text. Make a call. Send a snap. Create a handwritten letter. Remember those? We have brothers that might be fighting a battle you don't know about. So check in with them. And make your chapter or colony a place where your members can open up without being judged, without fear, so they can be themselves and ask for help if they truly need it. After all, it's challenging enough to be who you truly are. There's no need to be someone you're not. Brothers, thank you for joining tonight. Thank you to the Education Committee, the Executive Office staff, and all of you for being here. See you next week. Have a great night.